Hi, welcome to the Pride of the Pier podcast. This is our very first episode, and we're going to be talking about the intersection of disability and queerness in our local politics. My name is Kanan Durham. I'm the executive director here at Pride of the Pier, and my pronouns are he, him.
My name is Melissa Amarillas. My pronouns are she, her. I am a community college faculty member and I lead a neurodiversity faculty inquiry group.
Hi there. My name is Claire Raymond. I am from Orange County, California. So grew up a little closeted queer kid, and now I am running Wheelie Queer, and that's going to connect the communities locally between the LGBTQ plus and the disabled community.
Hi, my name is Lulu Trustman. My pronouns are she, her. And I also run Really Queer with Claire.
That's awesome. Well, we're recording this a day after the national news hit regarding President Joe Biden stepping out of the presidential race, and we're seeing a lot of focus in the news on Kamala Harris. Now, we cover local politics, but the reason that we're bringing this up is something we've seen in the Twitter sphere that kind of highlights that intersection of queerness and disability. There was a video that of Kamala Harris that was of her at an event with disability advocates, and she opens up her speech with, "I am Kamala Harris. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a woman sitting at a table wearing a blue suit." And she was saying this because she was describing herself to people who included blind folks. But of course, there's a lot of comments on these videos or on this video of her talking about how foolish it is that she's giving her pronouns and that she's describing herself. And it did seem to highlight, to me personally at least, this issue that we're seeing in a lot of the new anti-woke political culture that seems to be unable to include accessibility for marginalized communities, whether they be queer folks or disabled folks and beyond, within that political language. And I wanted to know what you had to think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. If you go onto my Instagram page, Living with Clarity, you'll find that um, all of my posts and all of my reels have image descriptions in them. Did it feel silly to do it at first? Yeah, I've never described myself in the third person. But once that becomes, I mean, that helps bring so much access to my community that it would be foolish of me not to include that. But I understand what she means by like, oh, it feels silly to say that because it is something interesting to try to describe yourself. Because I feel like we're in such a go, go, go world. You never sit down, have to think about the exact words of your physical appearance. So that's how I interpreted that, but I understand with the wording that she used might be interpreted different.
Yeah, very much so. Made her speech more accessible for people who are disabled. And I think a lot of times with accessibility, people think it's silly and there's no reason for it, but it helps someone have a little more access when it's important.
Yeah. I think that's valid. I think it makes me think about something that Melissa and I have talked a lot about regarding an action in our local politics here in Orange County recently. The city of Huntington Beach had an agenda item last November, I believe, to work on the city becoming a what's called a certified autism destination, which would have meant that when planning events, when planning any kind of normal city improvements, when handling their policies for their internal city employees, that they would be considering how to make these all of these aspects of city life more accessible to the neurodivergent community. And unfortunately, while the three minority members on that council did vote yes on it, including Councilwoman Natalie Moser, who brought that agenda to the table, we did see the conservative majority members abstain from voting, and expressing that this was an unnecessary, and they were talking about like the money that was going to be needed for it, despite the fact that there was no money in the agenda item. And I know Melissa and you and I talked quite a bit about that, and you had some concerns when you heard about the result, right?
Right. So what really struck me was that this was only a proposal to look at what it would take to become more autism friendly. As a huge tourist destination, Huntington Beach is Surf City, USA. It's a big destination close to Disneyland. And so this idea that the autistic population is not a valid enough population to even consider looking at the possibility of improving accessibility for that population. The idea that that's not a market, even if you look at it from a business perspective, that they're interested in entertaining. And also the critiques that the city council seemed to have were about like conflicting access needs, which is an important part of talking about inclusion. Is yes, there are many different ways to experience disability, to experience even one neurodivergence, and autism is labeled as a spectrum because if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So yes, there can be conflicting access needs, but that doesn't mean that we use that as an excuse not to even try to, look at the possibility of like, okay, well, what are some of the creative ways that many people have already implemented in providing a more accessible environment that benefits everybody? That's the other thing too, is when you make improvements for one population, oftentimes it also benefits the larger population as well.
Absolutely. You'll see even around Golden West College's campus, they're slowly updating all the buildings, and every building now, the new ones coming out, have accessible features that I see absolutely every student using. So it really doesn't take away, it only adds.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of historically things that were originally created to bring access to people that are now very helpful to, everyone, like curb cuts, and people use it with their strollers, and it's not just for people who are disabled, but it started that way.
It's funny you say that, because that was one of the things that in that November meeting, at that city council meeting in Huntington Beach, council member Dan Kalmik actually brought that specific thing up, talking about the curb cuts and the rumble mats and whatnot, and how
Literally called the curb cut theory.
I want to hear about that, but I want to hear about that. I want to know. So, but the reason I would bring it up, Dan Kalmik, is he talked about that in his the discussion at the city council, saying that he, as a young, like, he's a father of a young family, and when he's going on walks with his kid in a stroller, he's not disabled, his child is not disabled, but those curb cuts that have been newly installed they provide a better quality of life for him than he would have had without them. So what is the curb cut theory, Claire?
I mean, exactly what you're talking about. It's like you do something
um, for access specifically.
For access, and it benefits all.
Mm-hmm. And it's wonderful. Well, and I think there's. Oh, go ahead, Melissa.
I was gonna say, as a parent, like I think of the gender neutral bathrooms as well. Like if I'm out alone with my older boys and I don't feel comfortable sending them into the men's room by themselves, or a father is out with their daughter, what a wild concept. Having a gender neutral bathroom that they're able to access is really beneficial for them too.
Yeah, I think an example of a good access that we've had. I know I keep going back to Huntington Beach. There's a lot of cities in Orange County, but this has been a common discussion in Huntington Beach in recent years. Another thing that was recently that wasn't an access that was improved upon is the installation of the Moby mats. Now, Claire and Lulu, I mean, you guys are that's your actual lived experience as people who, you use wheelchairs. Do you want to describe what a Moby mat is?
It is a portable mat that they put down onto the beach to make it wheelchair accessible. We have had a few things with cities not upkeeping them. Like we went down to, was it Sunset Beach or Seal Beach that has it? And it was completely covered in sand. Couldn't use it anymore. So I love the concept because it gives me an accessible way to get my wheelchair down close enough to the ocean to at least see it, which is something that's just so sad as someone who grew up in Huntington Beach, that like it's such a hard work for me to even be able to see the ocean. So I don't take it for granted. So to show up back down at the beach and for that not to be upkept, and I lost my access again.
Well, and often a lot of times people leave strollers or wagons and stuff on it as well because they don't want to pull it through the sand, and then it blocks the whole thing off and it's no longer accessible to anyone.
I think that's a really good point about how accessibility is not accessibility unless it's accessible 365 days a year and upkept.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things. I don't personally know if the Moby mats in Huntington Beach are upkept very well. I'd like to look into that. But I actually spoke recently with Councilwoman Moser about the Moby mats because she is the one who got them put in, and the process for how they got put in, I think, is a really good way that we can talk about our engagement in the political system and how it can go beyond just going to a city council meeting. So the Moby mats were put in, they were installed May of 2021. The way that process started was there was a adaptable surfing instructor who reached out to Councilwoman Moser on Instagram and said, hey, this is an accessibility problem we have. Huntington Beach, like the beach itself is huge. It's one of the biggest beaches in California. I think it might be the biggest beach in California in terms of like distance from the parking lot to the water. And so for this surfing instructor, he had a student who has spina bifida. And so trying to get from the parking lot to the water was very, very challenging. So he reaches out to the councilwoman over Instagram and is like, hey, we've got a problem. Can we resolve this? And she actually it didn't go through a city council vote. It was never in a meeting. She worked with the city manager at the time. And because those Moby mats, they're not necessarily permanent, they can be rolled up in storms or whatever. They were able to use the city manager's discretionary funds. It was like $15,000, I think, to get those installed. So someone reached out to her in December, and in May they were installed, which if you know anything about how city government works, that
It's
is
a miracle.
yeah. And here's the exciting thing about that I think should inspire people to reach out when they're seeing accessibility problems or they're seeing a need for inclusion, as queer people, because there is that overlap, right? Is knowing about the ripple effect, because it can go both ways, right? So in this case, Katrina Foley, she is the county supervisor. She was county supervisor for the Huntington Beach area at the time. When they put in the Moby mats in Huntington Beach, they were the first Moby mats that were going to be there 365 days a year. Orange County. No other beach had done that prior to that point. Katrina Foley saw that, and she started pushing for those to be in other beaches. So I believe that Moby mat you're talking about in Seal Beach, I believe that happened, although not being upkept is not great, but that happened because of the ripple effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we look at the negative ripple effects, right? Like talking about pride flag bans. We saw one happen in Orange Unified School District. We saw one happen in Huntington Beach. We saw one happen at the county level. Ripple effects can be good, right? So it's like, what do you want to spread?
Beautifully said.
Sorry. I talk a lot.
No, never apologize for using your voice.
So I want to know, you talked about community college districts. And Lulu, we talked a little while ago and you talked about a story regarding like emergency access in community colleges. Can you share that?
Yes, we have a friend who was going to a college and they were going over, at the beginning of the year what all the safety protocols were and what to do if there was a fire. And her school, their whole plan for her was to wait at the top of the stairs and hope that someone would come find her. And that's not an uncommon plan for, I mean, schools, for lots of public
Buildings.
buildings, lots of things like that, where they just expect you to go and sit there and hope that somebody will find you and there's nothing that you can personally do to, ensure your safety.
She's a activist, so of course she makes a plaque and hangs it where she was told to stand and said something along the lines of disabled people wait here to die in the fire.
Oh
And put
God.
it on the wall and was like, let's do something about this. Because she, again, it's like, these are not only going to help me, these accessibility needs, it's going to help the next disabled kids to come. And I see a lot of young activists in college doing the exact same thing, saying, hey, we have rights. We don't, I feel like we're not told we have rights. I feel like a lot of it's word of mouth, which is why I think the internet's beautiful because it's given me a lot of resources to find. Um, but yeah,
Well, and community colleges, those are the community college districts, we vote on those boards just like we do for K through 12 education. Melissa, now you work in a college. So what's your experience with that?
I do. So I've taught at a community college in California for 5 years. And I mean, it's been a mixed bag of experiences. I served as a senator on our academic senate for 3 years as well. And I initially got started in academic senate by just attending meetings. Um,
And what does
because
Academic Senate do?
So Academic Senate is a nonprofit that, or it's like an overarching organization that supports academics. Like there's like the Academic Senate of the California Community Colleges, and then each college has their own individual academic senate. So this is made up of faculty members and it's a part of shared governance, which is this idea that decisions are made on college campuses not only by the administration and the board of trustees, but also by the faculty and by the students as well. They have a representative from student government that comes to each meeting and is able to give a report at that time. And so we have like a whole list of different things that we cover in academic senate. It's called 10+1, and it overarches like all of these different academic and professional matters that are related to policy development and like implementing things on campus, curriculum grading policies, standards for like how we like right now we're talking about like having experience-based education and where students can get credit for their prior experience. And so like that came through academic senate. And ultimately it makes recommendations. So we are not like changing the policy necessarily, but we recommend changes that are happening. And so I only got started by attending on Zoom. So it is a Brown Act meeting, but during the pandemic, we shifted all of our meetings on Zoom. And so then I was able to access those meetings more easily. They're open to the public. The agenda is posted online. The public is also able to still participate online, but since the emergency order has ended, the voting members go in person. But like one of the conversations that we had in academic senate that really impacted me as someone who is neurodivergent and has chronic illness is this idea that we were recommending that any like meeting on campus that was being led by faculty, not including like classes that are meeting, but like professional development meetings on campus would have a Zoom option.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I was like, well, sure. Like that's probably one of the only reasons that I started here and got comfortable here was because I had the option to like control my environment through which I participated. And it was a really contentious debate over whether or not we would want to place the burden on faculty members leading these meetings to provide accessibility through Zoom. And I was just floored that it was such a difficult like resolution to get through. And we actually ended up voting to like send it back to be workshopped. So I volunteered and I worked on wordsmithing the resolution and to kind of like water it down for people of like, if somebody requests it to be on Zoom, then we recommend that it be on Zoom. But it was surprising to me that we would have these ideas about, well, you can only fully participate in person. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, if somebody has social anxiety, they're not going to be fully present in person if they're worried about, the perception of them, right? Whereas being able to attend from a controlled environment is more beneficial. So, it was very eye-opening, and I do believe like our wordsmithed resolution did end up getting passed, but so most of our meetings do still have the option, if you want to attend on Zoom, we can. Except our Brown Act meetings, right? With the Brown Act, we do have rules and laws around that and accessibility, where voting members do have to attend in person.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because one of the things that I was looking at on our in my like research for this was there was a letter of opinion that was sent from it was a disability advocate group. I'm trying to find the name of it. But they sent a letter this year to the Deputy Attorney General talking about the fact that under the Brown Act, those meetings need to be accessible, which includes a Zoom meeting. And yet there are a number of governmental bodies in California that are not doing that. And who did it during COVID. And yet now they're like, well, the crisis is over. So we're gonna this thing that we created, this access that we created, we are going to pull back on that access, even though like maintaining it costs us essentially nothing. Now, Claire, you've said before that sorry, I keep calling on you. It's because your name's down there. Now, you've said before about how because part of the Pier, we do sometimes live stream the meetings that we're at from our Instagram, and you've commented that makes it more like that makes it easier for you to engage in what's happening in your community, right?
Yeah, I'm someone with a chronic illness, so that comes with it being unpredictable. And as much as I'd say, like, I'd love to be there today at 5, sometimes my body cannot drive me down there by 5. And so when I see that little Pride of the Pier is live, I know exactly why you're live, because you're you're live streaming the meetings, and it made it accessible. And also for someone starting to get more into local politics, I appreciated you whispering at the very bottom, going, "Okay, now the next thing on the board, they're gonna come up with this," and but it made it accessible for me because as someone, if I would have sat by myself in those meetings, I think I would have been much more lost. But I kind of got the background with it, and so moving things to having that hybrid option of in person and online. I mean, with schooling, that's the only reason I'm able to go to school right now is because of that. Um, it made it accessible for me. If I would have had my disability 30 years ago, education wouldn't be accessible to me. My local politics wouldn't be accessible to me. A lot of things wouldn't be accessible to me. And so I'm really grateful to see things moving in a direction where it does benefit people who can't have childcare and want to be involved still, who aren't feeling well enough to go. I don't know. But
And a lot of disabled people definitely have trouble getting transportation or finding transportation that is accessible to them, especially like as a wheelchair user. I know like manual chairs are a little easier to get access, but if you are in a power chair, those are very, very large, heavy chairs, and you have to have an accessible like ramp to be able to take those. And a lot of people in those situations do not have access to a vehicle to get them there. And so
and it's 3 hours travel by bus
live
to just go
streaming,
downtown.
live streaming is definitely a big help for the like disabled community.
Agreed.
Well, and that I think that flows into Pride events as well. I know that because Claire and Lulu, you guys were both in the Fourth of July parade with us, and I'm sure most people watching aren't aware that we had some behind the scenes logistics to get people from our like the point where we were all meeting before the parade, and then like ferrying everybody to the staging area that was like 3 miles away. It was an ordeal. Um, but we, trying to make sure that we were able to get, we had four people who used motorized wheelchairs to get you guys to the staging area. Like that was something that it took a small and worthwhile amount of effort, but it took an amount of effort for us to make sure that that happens. And I know that you've talked before about other events within the LGBTQ community, whether they be pride events or just queer events in general, that accessibility is not always as looked after.
I mean, even just Long Beach Pride, the whole festival was grass and hills. So you can only imagine my little gaggle of friends in wheelchairs were having a real big struggle on all the grass and hills. And I think about like pre-pandemic, I was not out, but you were out in the scene.
Yeah, yeah.
But you were in more traditional queer spaces, and you quickly saw that you were not welcomed there.
No, I mean, I have found that in general, some queer spaces we have had good luck with in terms of like people helping us out and wanting to make it accessible for us. But in general, I would say a lot of like queer meetups are not very accessible. They tend to be held on like grass or even a lot of like beach or like queer clubs and bars often are not the most accessible and are not always safe, even as a disabled person, because you are so much lower than everybody else. And, you give a bunch of people alcohol and then they can't see you anymore. And it becomes kind of a dangerous situation sometimes. But I mean, yeah, for us for Long Beach Pride, we couldn't access any of the booths or we didn't have access to getting water. We didn't have access to the bathrooms. And so there were parts that were good. They made the stage was accessible for us. And so that was nice. But in general, it is a kind of a repeat experience of showing up to queer spaces and not being able to navigate.
Yeah, yeah. I think, first of all, I hadn't even considered the idea of being in a wheelchair in a space surrounded by a bunch of drunk gay folks. And like, I know that I can get a little silly when you get a couple of margaritas in me. And I am sure that I would accidentally trip over somebody in a wheelchair if I wasn't paying attention. And I
Yeah.
never even considered that. Yeah, it's gotta be scary. It makes me think about Oceanside Pride. Last year. It was the first time I'd ever seen a feature like this in a Pride event. They had an indoor space that was kind of off from the booths and whatnot. It was for neurodivergent folks. That you could they had like art and whatnot, but you could go in, it was a quiet space, it was cooler, it was and I know like with Long Beach Pride, I know that they usually have ASL translators and whatnot, but that's
Yes.
a really good reminder of how just like the queer community is not a monolith, the disabled community is not a monolith. And just because you have
Yes.
accessibility for one part of it does not mean that you have like done your job and you can just finish. So it's a really good reminder. Yeah.
Yeah. We had a lot of organizers coming up to us being like, we made it accessible this year. Like, are you guys so excited? And we're like, if there wasn't a giant speaker right between us, I would tell you a lot of tips I have, but I can see the stage, so that's a plus.
Well, and I wonder if maybe Melissa, you might have thoughts on this, I feel like whether it be the disabled community, the queer community, the neurodivergent community, and those who fall in all, that there's a common trend of people who are living outside of our experience, who don't really understand that like the bare minimum is not enough. Is that
They
something that you
say
guys have
that
experienced?
ADA is the bottom. That's the floor. And we're trying to build up.
Mhm.
And ADA focuses on physical disabilities and physical access. So it really does leave out a lot of that neurodiversity issue as well. And one of the things that I read was about like fandoms and Comic Cons and how those events tend to actually be very accessible because they have neurodivergent and disabled people taking part in the planning,
Mhm.
in the leadership,
Mm.
in the execution of putting together these events. Because historically, like fandoms have very much been sort of like started and kept going and grown by neurodivergent people. And so for those neurodivergent access needs, they're often met pretty well at those types of events. I don't have personal experience. It was in one of the books that I read. But I feel like, in our conversation, a common theme that keeps coming up is like, well, I just wouldn't think of your access need because I don't have that need, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so.
Just because I don't have the same experience as you and the same access need as you doesn't mean that it's not valid, or that you're making it up. And I think that it's empathy, right? A lack of being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and try and understand, oh, your experience of the world around you is different from mine.
I was getting really excited when you were talking about the fact that these Comic-Con, like various comic conventions and whatnot, and fandom
Yeah.
conventions
Yeah.
they are so accessible because they are often like the planning and the execution is led by people who need these accessibility, like they need access. And that's the whole point, right? Like we're Pride of the Pier, we're local politics, right? Like there's a lot that goes into it, but that's the whole thing, right? Is we we will not see a change in our environment unless we go into these spaces and we start being a part of creating these spaces, right? And like there are people who may not necessarily even you know have any ill will towards our communities. They just don't understand. Not all of them.
Yeah.
Some of them do have ill will, but But yeah, it's such a that's a wonderful thing to highlight, because it's like that's a great example of how this works when we get involved.
Love that. Yeah, I
I love that.
completely agree. Just, it's hard to make accessibility for something that you're not understanding, and by including people who are having that lived experience, I think that's very important.
I do want to talk a little bit about some of the intersection within our politics, right? So I know we talked a little bit before, but in terms of things that we're seeing that with the queer community and the disabled community, one of the things that we've talked about when we did our civic engagement workshop on school boards, we talked a lot about how um, even if you're not a part of these communities, the decisions that school boards do, like the school decisions they make, can still affect you, just in terms of your taxpayer dollars, because there's so many lawsuits that are going on in our school boards. And we are seeing a trend in the kinds of leadership politically that is willing to, for example, if you've got a student that needs higher accessibility, if they've got a an IEP, is that right, Melissa? What is it called with the yeah, so they've got like the extra needs within their school day. There are a lot of students that are not having their needs met, and many school boards are more interested in just paying out a settlement with taxpayer money than actually enacting change. It's a very large amount of the budget for a lot of school boards in Orange County and across California in general. And we're also seeing some of those same school boards are the ones that are willing to sue the state over their desire to enforce policies that are anti-LGBTQ. So there, for example, in the Orange County Board of Education, they were suing the state over the mask mandates in Orange County schools, saying that like this isn't necessary. We don't need to put kids in masks. Like kids don't get COVID, which isn't accurate. And just completely disregarding the needs of kids that do, I mean, not just kids in general, but also like kids who have immune issues, right? And kids who maybe like now they're in school, right? Like they're physically in school, and if none of their classmates are wearing masks, so there's a lawsuit with the Orange County Board of Education against the state regarding the mask mandates. And we also have an incoming superintendent of education for Orange County who has pledged to, or he implied in his interview that he would sue the state if the Safety Act was passed, right? So you have the same people who are willing to sue the state over not providing access, like not providing a safe environment for students, especially students who have like disabilities and immunity issues. That's the same board that's willing to sue over their ability to what we at Pride of the Pier would consider persecuting LGBTQ students. And there's a huge overlap in that.
I'm at a loss of words. I'm just like, holy crap, just got worse and worse.
But these are elected officials, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
obviously, at Pride of the Pier, we're like we don't endorse for or against any political candidate, but we do find the actions concerning. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. So I think that's beyond just the fact that there are many people who exist in, whether it be the neurodivergence, whether it be physical disabilities, whether it be the queer communities, a lot of people who exist in one, two, or three of those. But also, it seems, going back to what we were talking about earlier at the very start of this with Kamala Harris and how she was being mocked by a far right faction of the internet for giving her pronouns and
Oh my god.
describing what she was wearing to a blind audience. There really does seem to be in some parts of our political culture, a melding of these two issues. Is that
Well,
something that you've seen?
yeah, and I think that it's sometimes comes down to this idea that like having the legislation that supports disabled people or even queer people also like, oh, that's enough to just have the legislation, right? To say that you can't be discriminated against. But it's a whole nother thing to actually enforce legislation, to um, even go beyond the legislation because it's the bare minimum, right? And so that was like a conversation that came up in my graduate level class in special education because we had so many people in the class who were special education teachers or aides. And it's like, yes, we have all these systems in place for disabled students, students who need extra support. But then the reality of actually accessing those supports, whether it be parents who don't fully understand their child's academic needs or what's being offered to them in school, and so they deny services, or it's administration, not staffing the positions, and then, oh, your child missed speech therapy this week because we just didn't have a speech therapist available. And also, just all of the red tape that comes along with relying on legislation to provide access. And if you don't check the right boxes, you don't get to access those services, which is really frustrating for all of the people working there who just want to see this kid thrive, the parents who want to see their child thrive. And it, like, those services might be there, but if you can't access them, then they don't have any impact on that student.
I think a lot of times also parents or like they don't necessarily know what is available to them, and having to really go out and search for it yourself to find what's available in terms of accommodations and support. I think most people don't even know what is a possibility for them to get support in. And so I think it ends up being a detriment to a
Mhm.
lot of people who need access, and they just have no idea that that's even a possibility.
Yeah, as a parent myself, trying to access services for my child, like the feeling of finding out that my child had qualified for services in September and those services were never provided. And then until it was brought up in an April meeting that my child had qualified for them. And it's like, then the passing of the ball, right? Of like, oh, well, there's a new policy, the policy's changed, and it was just so frustrating. And I'm like, I have a master's degree and I can't figure out this system. And so like I would leave these meetings and I'm like, what if English was my second language? What if,
Yeah.
I worked full time and couldn't take a single day off without risking losing my job. Like I couldn't participate in these meetings the same way that I am right now. And I have to, otherwise, these services aren't going to be provided. And so it was only once there was like this clear issue with, access to services that wasn't being met, that all of a sudden needs were being met. And so it should never get to that point, but sometimes it does. And then if you're talking about college students, that's a whole nother ballgame because the same rules do not apply if you're a disabled college student. Um, you have to become your advocate for yourself as soon as you enroll in college. The school is no longer your advocate, like running the process of getting an IEP or getting a 504 plan. It's your responsibility to provide documentation of your disability to the office, to attend meetings, and then disclose your accommodations to your instructors. So then all of a sudden, as soon as you're a college student, it's all on you. It's completely different from the K through 12 setting.
Oh, well, and I feel like that's a really good example of why like community matters and all like for
Yes.
whether it's the neurodivergent community, whether it's the disabled community, and I know there's overlap with that, or whether it's the queer community, is it's something you said, Melissa, is that like trying to be an advocate for yourself. I know for me, like as a trans person, there's a lot of stress that I'm under in our current climate, and there's a lot of things, in terms of like accessing my own healthcare and figuring all of that out and figuring out the legal process for changes and whatnot. I mean, I'm not a college student trying to get an IEP, but still navigating our government system, right? Because it all falls under the government system. Navigating the government system when you are already dealing with stressful challenges that just come with being who you are is exhausting, and trying to do that by yourself, like no wonder so many of us fall between the cracks. Is that something that you've
Absolutely.
experienced, Lulu?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've had to have my fair share of like fighting for accommodations. And I know like I was lucky as a like disabled child that I had parents who were very educated in disability and learning disabilities and neurodivergence in general. So I was given a lot of tools to be able to fight for that, but I I mean one of my schools I went to for my disability, I had a whole class where the only thing they taught us was how to advocate for ourselves so that when we left that school, we'd be able to get the support that we needed in our next, in our jobs, in our college, and all of
Amazing.
that.
I know we all need that.
Well, and
And
I guess that's the whole point, right? It's like we need community. And I think, Claire, you and I've talked about this before about how whether you are somebody who has become disabled as an adult, or you're somebody who comes out of the closet as an adult, I think especially in those two situations, you're very much like you're on a whole different planet, speaking in a whole different language, people you don't know, and trying to find your community in that. Like, we talk about the need for pride, whether it be disability pride or LGBTQ pride. It's not just about, oh, let's just celebrate who we are. It's like we need community to be able to figure out how to navigate a world that isn't really currently built for us.
yeah, yeah, I think in general, um, there's not a lot of understanding from um, people who are not actively fighting for their rights, that it's you're just trying to navigate your world, and having just that little bit of support makes such a big difference for you. And if you have absolutely like no one in your corner, it's hard for you to navigate all of those different needs.
I just feel like I am an outspoken person, and so I think that kind of gave me an up in terms of finding community, because when I came out and I felt, at least in myself, a little comfy with the identity, I was taking classes during COVID, and I would quite literally introduce myself as, "Hi, my name's Claire. I'm from Orange County, and I'm queer." And then that's how I met my fiance. She reached out to me because that's how I introduced myself.
God, I gotta start doing that for me. That's how I gotta find myself a date. I'm queer. I'm queer.
Okay.
Hi, yes,
If you
table
have
for
your
one.
laptop
I'm
open,
queer.
people know.
True.
Yeah,
Or
for
your water
anybody,
bottle.
See
for
all the
those
stickers.
watching, don't realize, my laptop is covered in very queer stickers. But yeah, so I think, I know we're nearing the end of our time. I think I'd like to make sure that we talk about like how people can be engaged. I know there's a lot of people in the queer community who are neurodivergent, who are mobility disabled, who have, immunocompromised systems, or many of the other things that prevent you from participating in local politics in the same way that many other people do. And I can say that when it comes to any kind of Brown Act meeting, those agendas they are legally required to upload those online within like 72 hours before the meeting. So for example, using Huntington Beach, as always, as an example, their meetings are on Tuesday. They upload their agendas Thursday night online on the city website. And then from that point, you can always email. Most city councils and school boards will have on their agenda you need to email by this point for it to be considered. But if you email in, it will be like they're required to read those and they will be considered. I can't guarantee they'll be read. They should hopefully be considered. um, and then also, most local school boards and city council meetings and special districts and whatnot are, at least in Orange County, most of them are available virtually, whether it be on YouTube or there's some that do, I think Coppell Unified School District does. I think it's on like the school website or whatnot. Don't quote me on that. There's a few that they do it on their own platform. Um, and if you are someone who, for example, if you are a wheelchair user and you're like, I can't be in this space for very long, I believe if you email ahead of time to the city clerk, which is generally information you can find on a city website, or school boards also have their clerks. If you email the clerk and say, hey, I have an accessibility need, you can generally be put to the very top of the list of the people that are doing public comment, regardless if you get there, when they first start taking comment cards. But that's also just with Brown Act meetings. There are ways that you can get engaged in your community in civic systems without necessarily going to those types of meetings. So, Melissa, you talked about the academic senate, which I think absolutely falls under your civic engagement, right? There are a lot of other community platforms like that you can get involved in. And if you're looking to to get your voice heard, but you say, for example, don't think that a city council might hear your need for accessibility, there are other avenues. I know I mentioned with the Moby Mats that they never even went through the city council. The person who asked someone someone on the council they thought would be open to it, and that person went through the city manager, right? It never even came to a vote. But you can also do things like most local communities will have a visitors bureau, like a tourism bureau, especially in Orange County because we have a lot of tourism. So like Anaheim will have a visitors bureau, Lagunas Beach will have a visitors bureau, San Clemente will have a visitors bureau. And those are generally those are the corporations. The business community, right? So, like using the example of the Moby Mats, after the Moby Mats were installed, there were more people who had mobility needs who were coming to Huntington Beach, and so a lot of those beach hotels started
Yeah.
offering beach wheelchairs. So it's this ripple effect, right? And I think that also goes when it comes to accessibility and inclusion in the queer community, right? Like you don't necessarily need to, if you're in a community that you're like, oh, I could never get my city to fly the pride flag, you might be able to work with the business community to see if they'd be willing to put up pride flags in their storefronts. Like, so there are ways that you can get involved and you can try to increase inclusion for yourself as a marginalized person without necessarily going through the avenues that you think might not be successful. Are there any things that you guys have that you in your experience that you've done to try to increase inclusivity in your lives?
I mean, I finally launched Wheelie Queer. I do a once a month monthly meetup with other disabled queer people in the Orange County area. We have people who drive into it, into town for it. It's just a space where people can feel welcomed and you're heard and seen for exactly who you are. And that was my biggest.
And it's accessible.
And it's accessible. Where we're going, I mean, if they can't take one of us, they can't take all of us. So
I love that. I was gonna say, Melissa, do you have any recommendations for, especially for like college students who have accessibility needs? Anything you would suggest to them to try to increase, their accessibility?
Yeah. I think right now in academia, my experience is like we're just starting to talk about neurodiversity in these inclusion conversations. And I know it can be really difficult because sometimes in academia, it's hard to get change to happen. And so it's really about like individual people becoming the change on their campus. So one of the resources that I looked at was like the College Autism Network. And they are putting together a lot of really great research on autistic college students. And what really struck me in listening to them talk about their different programs on campus is like they really seemed grassroots, right? So like one person on campus saw this need and they talked to people and they said, what do we need to do to get this going? And as soon as people on campus start to realize that there is this need, that isn't being met for students, they get on board. But it really comes down to like, are we talking about intersectional identity when we're talking about inclusion? Are we making safe spaces for our LGBTQ population? Like we had a safe space training for faculty on campus. I'm going to be talking about our neurodiversity faculty inquiry group at our upcoming training. We're talking about, English learners and how to support them better. Like all of these different student populations, we're finally starting to talk about like, how do we meet individual needs as well as intersectional needs? And so if you see a need on your campus, bring it up, start talking about it, and find avenues like if you're a college student and you see a need, talking to the Disability Resource Center, talking to your dean of students, and your faculty. If you find faculty who are safe places to disclose as well, like we're here to help and mentor and support however we can.
I love that. I love that. That's awesome. Well, with that, I think we can say a happy Disability Pride Month. And also we, for our viewers out there in the digital world, we're going to be putting the links in the doobly-doo. God, I'm showing my age, my YouTube age on that one. We're going to be putting our links in the description about some of the resources that you've heard here, especially Claire and Lulu's the Wheelie podcast, and we hope to see you at the next episode. Bye, guys.
thanks for having
Bye.
us. Bye.